The atmosphere was electric, charged with anticipation. On a cold, crisp evening in Stockholm, Sweden, the Nordic Warrior 3 event was about to unfold in front of an eager crowd. The lights dimmed, the air thick with excitement, and the fans knew they were about to witness something special. The night wasn't just about any regular fight. It was the beginning of a legacy that would eventually shake the world of MMA. Khamzat Chimaev, a name few knew at the time, was about to step into the cage, but there was something different about him. There was an intensity in his eyes, a quiet confidence that seemed to suggest he wasn't just another fighter looking for a win. He was destined for something greater, and April 14, 2018 would prove to be the first chapter in what would become an extraordinary journey. On the other side of the cage stood Adnan Music, an experienced competitor, eager to make his mark. He had trained hard for this moment, and the weight of the opportunity was palpable. Yet, as the bell rang and the fight began, something immediately set Khamzat apart from every other opponent Music had faced. The way Khamzat moved fluid, relentless, and with an intensity that seemed almost inhuman was a clear indicator that this was no ordinary opponent. Crowd roared, the tension building as the two fighters circled each other. But it didn't take long for Khamzat to assert his dominance. Within seconds, he launched forward with a precision that left Music on the defensive. His punches were sharp, his movements calculated, as if he was a predator closing in on its prey. Every strike seemed to tell a story, each one a message of determination, of a young fighter who knew his time was coming. The way he flowed through the fight, unpredictable, yet methodical, was mesmerizing to watch. In the blink of an eye, Khamzat found his opening. A barrage of punches rained down on Adnan Music, each one landing with devastating accuracy. It was clear that Khamzat had found his rhythm, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. Music, caught off guard by the ferocity of the attack, struggled to defend himself. The crowd watched in awe as the young fighter from Sweden demonstrated a striking power and speed that few had ever seen. Khamzat wasn't just throwing punches, he was sending a message to the MMA world: I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. It wasn't long before the referee stepped in, signaling the end of the fight. A TKO victory for Khamzat Chimaev, and just like that, his professional MMA career had officially begun. But what made this win so significant wasn't just the dominant performance, it was the way Khamzat made it look so easy. He had come into this fight with a calm and collected demeanor, but what he showed inside the cage was something far more terrifying. His combination of raw power, speed, and precision struck fear into anyone who saw it. It was a statement victory, a preview of the dominant force he would become in the world of MMA. For Adnan Music, the loss was disappointing, but he didn't leave the cage empty-handed. He had faced a future star, and in that moment, he knew that Khamzat Chimaev was someone who would change the landscape of mixed martial arts forever. Music's valiant effort, though short-lived, had become part of the story, a stepping stone in the rise of one of MMA's brightest stars. But for Khamzat, this fight was just the beginning. This victory was more than just a win. It was the start of a legacy that would take him to the highest levels of the sport. What followed would be a series of fights that would solidify his name in the history books of MMA. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for Khamzat Chimaev, nothing worth having ever is. With his raw talent and relentless drive, he was ready to take on whatever challenges lay ahead. But as the night came to an end, one question remained: what would happen next? Khamzat had proven that he was a force to be reckoned with, but this was only one fight, one victory in a long journey. Little did anyone know, his rise to the top was just beginning, and with every win, every fight, And every challenge, Khamzat would continue to grow, evolve, and change the world of MMA forever. The story was far from over. It had only just begun. As we look back at this first victory, we are left to wonder what would happen next. Would Khamzat continue to dominate in the way he had done so in his debut? How would his skills evolve as he faced tougher, more experienced opponents? The MMA world was watching closely, and everyone knew that Khamzat Chimaev was not just a flash in the pan. He was a fighter who would shape the future of mixed martial arts. And the question on everyone's mind was simple: how far could he go? The stage was set, and the world would soon find out. As Khamzat Chimaev walked back to the locker room after his first victory, the weight of what had just transpired began to settle in. He had heard the roar of the crowd and felt the adrenaline rush through his veins, but it wasn't until he was alone with his thoughts that the magnitude of the moment fully hit him. This was the start of something bigger, something that would push him further than he had ever imagined. The first round TK had been swift, brutal, and precise, but it was only the beginning of what was to come. The fight with Adnan music, though dominant, wasn't just about the victory itself. It was the way Khamzat had handled himself, the calmness, the discipline, and the focus. As he sat down in the locker room, his coach, a man with years of experience in the sport, looked at him with a mixture of pride and expectation. He had seen Khamzat's potential from the very beginning, but this fight confirmed what he had known all along. Khamzat was a once-in-a-lifetime talent. "You did well, but this is just the start," his coach said, looking him in the eye. "There are tougher opponents ahead. You're not going to walk through every fight like this." Khamzat nodded, but in his mind, there was no doubt that he could. He wasn't just a fighter. He was a force of nature, a whirlwind that no one could stand against. At that moment, he wasn't thinking about his next opponent, but about the bigger picture. He wanted to be remembered as one of the greatest, a name that would be whispered with reverence in the MMA world. But he knew he had to take it one fight at a time, no matter how confident he felt. Back home in Sweden, Khamzat's training intensified. He spent hours in the gym, pushing his limits in every aspect of his game. His striking, already powerful and precise, became even more fluid, more dangerous. But it was his grappling and wrestling that truly set him apart from the rest. His natural athleticism, combined with an unyielding work ethic, made him a formidable opponent in every aspect of the sport. No one could match his pace, and few could withstand the pressure he brought to the cage. But the road to the top wasn't going to be easy. Khamzat knew that the higher he climbed, the harder the challenges would become. He had faced Adnan music, a worthy opponent, but as his career progressed, the stakes would get much higher. Every victory brought him closer to the elite fighters of the sport, and each fight tested his resolve in new ways. Khamzat thrived in the pressure, but he knew that he couldn't afford to get complacent. The UFC, the pinnacle of MMA, was calling, and he had to be ready. As the weeks passed, Khamzat's name began to spread through the MMA community. Fighters started to take notice, and whispers of his raw talent and destructive fighting style reached the ears of promoters, analysts, and fans alike. But for Khamzat, it wasn't enough to just be good. He wanted to dominate, to leave no doubt in anyone's mind that he was the best. Every day, he pushed himself harder, focused on improving his weaknesses and refining his strengths. And then the call came. The UFC had been keeping a close eye on him, and they wanted to bring him to the biggest stage in MMA. It was the moment Khamzat had been waiting for, the opportunity to prove himself on the world's biggest platform. But with that opportunity came a new set of challenges. The fighters in the UFC were no joke. They were the best in the world, and every one of them would be gunning for him. But Khamzat wasn't afraid. He had faced adversity before, and he had come out on top. This was his time, and nothing was going to stop him from reaching the top. The anticipation for his UFC debut was palpable. Fans and analysts alike wondered what kind of impact Khamzat would have in the promotion. Could he continue his dominance in the cage? Would he live up to the hype? As the date of his debut drew near, Khamzat's nerves began to settle. He had already proven himself in smaller promotions, but this was the UFC, the biggest stage in the world. It was his moment to shine, to show the world what he was truly capable of. When the day finally arrived, Khamzat felt the weight of the moment. The lights were brighter, the arena louder, and the crowd more intense. But none of that mattered to him. He walked into the octagon with the same calm demeanor he had shown in his previous fights. The cage door closed behind him, and for a moment, it was just him and his opponent. No distractions, no noise. This was where Khamzat was meant to be. His UFC debut came against a tough opponent, someone who had been in the game for years and knew what it took to survive at the highest level. But Khamzat was a different breed. From the moment the fight began, he imposed his will. The speed, the power, the relentless pace, it was too much for his opponent to handle. Khamzat overwhelmed him, landing brutal strikes and displaying an incredible level of control on the ground. By the end of the first round, his opponent was already on the back foot, struggling to find a way to mount any offense. As the second round began, Khamzat wasted no time. He picked up right where he left off, unleashing a barrage of punches that sent his opponent reeling. The crowd was on their feet, watching in awe as Khamzat delivered one of the most dominant performances in recent memory. Within minutes, his opponent was on the canvas, and Khamzat secured a TKO victory. The UFC had just witnessed the arrival of a new star, a fighter who was not just here to compete, but here to dominate. The win was a statement, but it was also a reminder of the challenges that lay ahead. Khamzat knew that the competition would only get tougher from here. The UFC was home to the best fighters in the world, and every opponent would be a test of his skills, his resolve, and his ability to adapt. But if there was one thing Khamzat had proven so far, it was that he had the heart of a champion. No matter who stood in his way, he would find a way to win. As the days passed, the buzz around Khamzat's victory grew. Fans and analysts alike began to realize that they were witnessing the rise of a fighter who could potentially reshape the landscape of MMA. But while others were starting to believe in his potential, Khamzat knew that nothing was guaranteed. Every fight, every victory would have to be earned. But what was clear to everyone was that Khamzat Chimaev was a name that would be remembered for years to come. His debut was just the beginning of what promised to be a legendary career. And for the fans who had followed his journey from the Nordic Warrior 3 event, they knew that they had witnessed something special, something that would change the world of MMA forever. As the sun set on the arena that night, the question lingered in the air. How far could Khamzat Chimaev go? What would his future hold? The answer, however, was something only time would reveal. But one thing was certain: Khamzat's journey was far from over, and the world would be watching as he continued to rise, one fight at a time. Khamzat Chimaev's early victories in the UFC had set the stage for a rise that no one could have predicted. The way he dominated his opponents, with an intensity and precision that was almost surreal, had everyone talking. Yet, while the fans and analysts were quick to sing his praises, there was something simmering beneath the surface that Khamzat himself couldn't shake. Despite the victories, despite the accolades, there was still a lingering uncertainty, one that kept him awake at night, pacing in the quiet of his room after every fight. The deeper he went into the UFC, the closer he got to his goal of becoming one of the greatest to ever do it, the greater the stakes became. He wasn't just fighting for a title anymore. He was fighting for something more primal, something that had been with him since his first step into the cage, the desire to prove that he was invincible. But the higher he climbed, the more the pressure mounted. Each fight brought with it not only a new opponent, but a new challenge that tested more than just his fighting skills. It was his mind, his will, his heart that were being tested in ways he had never experienced before. In the early days, it had been simple win or lose, survive or fall. But now, as he rose through the ranks, Khamzat realized that he was no longer just fighting for himself. He was fighting for something bigger, something that even he didn't fully understand. His confidence was undeniable, but with it came an undercurrent of doubt that occasionally crept into his thoughts. His journey had started with a simple desire to fight, to showcase his skills and make a name for himself. But now, as the lights of the UFC shone brighter, Khamzat began to wonder whether he was ready for what came next. Questions never stopped. What would happen when he met a fighter who could match his pace? Who could withstand the pressure he brought? The next level of competition was unlike anything he had faced before, and Khamzat knew that he had to evolve. He couldn't remain the same fighter forever. He had to grow, adapt, and find a way to keep pushing the boundaries of what he was capable of. The intensity of the training camps became even more grueling. Khamzat spent hours at the gym, perfecting his techniques, drilling his strikes, and sharpening his ground game. But it wasn't just physical preparation that consumed him, it was the mental aspect. Every fighter he faced from here on out would be just as focused, just as hungry. They wouldn't be intimidated by his reputation. They would come with everything they had, and Khamzat needed to be ready for that. The pressure to perform, to keep winning, to stay on top, was taking a toll on him in ways he hadn't anticipated. In one of his sparring sessions, Khamzat found himself locked in a difficult exchange with one of his teammates, a fighter who had been with him since the early days. The session started like any other. Punches were thrown, takedowns executed, but then something unexpected happened. Khamzat found himself on the receiving end of a few hits he hadn't anticipated. For the first time in what felt like forever, he was struggling to find his rhythm. His opponent, sensing the shift, capitalized on the moment, landing a sharp strike that shook Khamzat. He paused, momentarily stunned, and as the session ended, Khamzat couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. It wasn't the strike that rattled him. It was the realization that his opponents were getting better. His invincibility, the thing that had driven him for so long, was starting to crack. The lingering doubts began to seep into his mind. What if there was someone out there who could stop him? What if, despite all the training and all the victories, he wasn't as invincible as he thought? The feeling was foreign, unsettling. Khamzat had built his career on the idea that no one could stand up to him. But now, the uncertainty began to eat away at him, piece by piece. He was becoming obsessed with the idea of failure, something he had never allowed himself to consider before. Every fight, every opponent, started to feel like a test not only of his skills, but of his very identity as a fighter. His team noticed the shift in his demeanor. His coach, who had been with him since the beginning, pulled him aside after the sparring session. "You're thinking too much," he said. "You've got the tools. You just need to trust yourself again. Trust the work you've put in." But it wasn't that simple for Khamzat. The pressure of living up to expectations his own, and those of the fans who had quickly elevated him to hero status, was overwhelming. He wasn't sure if he could ever silence the doubts in his mind, but he knew that he had to find a way to move forward. The UFC was no longer just a series of fights. It was a battleground, and his name was on the line every time he stepped inside the octagon. Meanwhile, as Khamzat wrestled with his internal conflict, the rest of the MMA world continued to watch. His next opponent, a fighter known for his unbreakable mental toughness and relentless will to win, was gaining traction as a potential threat to Khamzat's streak. The media had caught wind of the upcoming matchup, and the narrative began to take shape. Khamzat, the unstoppable force, versus an opponent who had shown time and time again that he could weather any storm. The closer the fight drew, the more the tension mounted. Khamzat tried to push aside the doubts, but they lingered. He couldn't escape the weight of the expectations, and the thought of a loss, something that seemed unimaginable just a few months ago, began to gnaw at him. He began to question whether he had truly prepared for what was ahead. His opponent was a seasoned veteran, a fighter who had been through the wars and emerged victorious time and time again. He wasn't going to be intimidated by Khamzat's reputation. Every day in the gym felt like a battle in itself. Khamzat's teammates could see the shift in his energy. He wasn't the same fighter who had come out of nowhere, dominating everyone in his path. This Khamzat was more cautious, more reserved, and that made everyone around him nervous. Was he still the same force they had all watched rise? Or was the pressure of the spotlight starting to break him? The night before the fight, Khamzat sat alone in his room, reflecting on everything that had led him to this point. The victories, the hype, the pain, it all seemed to blur together. His mind raced as he thought about the looming battle ahead. He couldn't afford to let his doubts win. The fight wasn't just about the opponent in front of him. It was about proving to himself that he could overcome the mental battle as much as the physical one. Tomorrow, everything would change. But what kind of fighter would he be when he stepped into the octagon? The journey was far from over, and the tension would continue to build as Khamzat prepared for what was to come. The UFC had never seen a fighter quite like him, unstoppable, powerful, and full of potential. But the real test was yet to come. Would he be able to rise above the mental hurdles, the self-doubt, and the pressure? Or would he fall short and prove that even the most dominant forces have their limits? The answer was just one fight away, but for now, Khamzat had to find a way to silence the doubts and embrace the challenge that awaited him. As the days drew closer to the fight, Khamzat found himself wrestling with his thoughts more than ever before. The pressure was mounting, and despite all the hours spent in the gym, the constant drilling, the mental conditioning, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. The questions in his mind had only intensified. Was he really ready for this next challenge? Could he truly silence the critics and prove once again that he was the fighter everyone believed him to be? The weight of expectation had become a constant companion. It wasn't just the UFC and its fans who expected greatness, it was Khamzat himself. He had reached a level where every victory seemed to demand an even greater one. He had tasted the sweet rush of success, but now he was faced with the reality of what that success demanded: perfection. He wasn't just fighting for a title anymore. He was fighting for the very essence of who he was. The battle had shifted from an external conflict with opponents in the cage to an internal war of self-doubt and pressure. As the day of the fight arrived, Khamzat's thoughts seemed to race faster than ever. He knew his opponent well, a man who had been around the sport long enough to know exactly how to handle the bright lights, how to weather the storm, and most importantly, how to stay calm when everything around him seemed to be spiraling. His opponent had a reputation for being unshakable, a fighter who never faltered under pressure. But Khamzat had never been one to back down from a challenge. If anything, this was exactly what he had trained for, to face someone who was willing to take everything he had and still keep coming forward. It was the morning before the fight, and Khamzat found himself walking through the quiet corridors of the arena. His heart thumped loudly in his chest, but he refused to let the nervous energy take over. Every step he took was a reminder of how far he had come and how much was at stake. He could hear the distant sounds of fans beginning to filter into the venue, their excitement growing as they anticipated the main event. Khamzat could feel their eyes on him, even though he hadn't stepped into the cage yet. The world was waiting. The weight of that was heavy, but it also fueled something deeper within him. He couldn't afford to let the pressure define him. This was his moment. Back in the locker room, Khamzat sat alone for a moment, trying to clear his mind. Quietness was almost deafening. His coach entered, giving him a brief nod of encouragement, but Khamzat barely acknowledged it. His focus was laser sharp. Every movement, every breath was calculated, precise. He had trained for this moment, and now there was no room for hesitation. Minutes before the fight, the atmosphere in the arena was electric. Fans were on the edge of their seats, some waving flags, others chanting the names of their favorite fighters. Khamzat's name echoed through the loudspeakers as he made his way to the cage, but even with the roar of the crowd, he was eerily calm. The energy around him felt like static electricity, and yet he walked with purpose, eyes focused only on the task at hand. Inside the octagon, the lights dimmed, and the spotlight focused solely on Khamzat and his opponent. The tension was palpable. Both fighters sized each other up, each one trying to find the smallest opening, the faintest sign of vulnerability. For a moment, it felt like time itself had slowed down. There was no turning back now. The bell rang, and the first exchange of strikes set the tone for what was about to unfold. Khamzat moved with a fluidity that made him look almost unstoppable, darting in and out with rapid, powerful punches. His opponent, however, was more than prepared. He countered with precision, his movements calculated, each strike meant to find its mark. For every punch Khamzat threw, his opponent was there, anticipating, reacting. It was clear that this wasn't going to be a one-sided fight. The battle for supremacy was far from over. Khamzat, who had always dominated with sheer aggression, found himself having to adjust. The familiar rhythm of the fight was disrupted. His opponent didn't crumble under the pressure. He didn't back down. He fought back with an intensity that matched Khamzat's own. Each strike, each maneuver, was a test. Was Khamzat truly as unstoppable as he believed? The fight had become a dance of wills, with both men unwilling to give an inch. Khamzat pushed forward, unleashing a flurry of strikes, but his opponent was relentless, refusing to let Khamzat dictate the pace. As the rounds wore on, the fight grew more grueling. Khamzat could feel the toll of the battle on his body. His energy was being drained, and though he pushed forward, there was an undeniable sense of fatigue creeping in. He had always prided himself on his cardio, on his ability to outlast his opponents, but this was different. His opponent was pacing himself perfectly, never allowing Khamzat to get ahead for long. With each exchange, Khamzat's doubt began to resurface, but he fought to suppress it. His mind was flooded with memories of his past struggles, of the countless hours spent in the gym, of the sacrifices he had made to get to this point. But it wasn't enough to silence the voice that whispered in his head, asking him if he was truly ready for this moment. What if his opponent was better prepared? What if his body couldn't keep up? The crowd's roars reached a fever pitch as the fight entered its final round. Khamzat could hear the chants, the cheers, but it felt distant. All that mattered was the man standing across from him. This was it, the culmination of everything he had worked for. He had come this far, and there was no turning back now. The final minutes ticked away, and both fighters were bloodied, bruised, and exhausted. Each punch landed with more force than the last. Each takedown attempt was met with fierce resistance. Khamzat's mind raced. He couldn't let this slip away. Not now. Not when everything he had worked for was on the line. In the final moments, Khamzat saw an opening, a brief hesitation from his opponent, a moment of vulnerability. He moved in, throwing a powerful combination that landed clean. His opponent staggered, and for the first time in the fight, Khamzat saw the cracks. He moved in for the finish, his instincts taking over. This was his moment. But was it enough to secure victory? The seconds felt like hours as Khamzat unleashed everything he had left. The fight had reached its peak, but would it be enough to claim the win? The answer was just a heartbeat away, but in that moment, everything was still uncertain. The tension hung in the air as the crowd held its breath, waiting for what came next. As Khamzat surged forward, believing he had his opponent on the edge, the arena seemed to hold its breath. But just as he prepared to land the decisive blow, something unexpected happened. His opponent, whom Khamzat had underestimated for a moment, regained his composure in a flash, as though he had been waiting for this very opening. In a blur, he countered with a crushing hook that caught Khamzat off guard, throwing him off balance and sending him crashing to the canvas. The crowd erupted into a deafening roar as the tide of the fight shifted in an instant. For the first time in this fight, Khamzat's legs felt unsteady. His mind was still sharp, but his body, a body that had never faltered in the face of adversity, was telling him something different. He had been hit harder than he had anticipated. The blow to his jaw reverberated through his entire being, leaving a haze of disorientation in its wake. He struggled to gather himself, blinking rapidly as his vision blurred for a split second. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. This fight wasn't over. Far from it. What had seemed like a moment of triumph was quickly slipping through his fingers. His opponent, who had been so meticulously patient throughout the fight, was now coming alive. Every second that passed made it clearer this man was no ordinary fighter. He had the heart of a warrior, the determination of someone who would do whatever it took to win. Khamzat pushed himself up, gritting his teeth through the pain. His body screamed for rest, but his mind wouldn't allow it. This was the moment that defined him, the moment where he had to prove that he wasn't just a fighter, but a champion. He couldn't afford to let this slip away. His opponent, sensing the opening, pressed forward, his strikes coming faster, harder, with more intention. Khamzat could feel the weight of the pressure now. The fight that had once felt like a foregone conclusion was now a battle for survival. Each punch, each movement, felt like it could be the one that determined everything. In the chaos of the exchange, something strange began to happen, something that Khamzat could not have predicted. Crowd, who had been so electrified just moments earlier, now seemed to waver in their collective energy. The roars of the fans mixed with whispers of uncertainty. The fight wasn't just about the two men inside the cage anymore. It had become something bigger, something darker. As the seconds ticked away, Khamzat noticed that his opponent's eyes weren't just filled with the intensity of competition. They were filled with something deeper, something personal. It was then that Khamzat began to understand that this was no ordinary fight. His opponent wasn't just fighting for the win, or for the title, or for the glory. He was fighting for something more primal, revenge, perhaps, or redemption. It didn't matter. What mattered was that the man in front of him was willing to sacrifice everything to win. And that made him dangerous, in a way Khamzat had never encountered before. But as Khamzat stood there, taking deep breaths, trying to shake off the fog that threatened to cloud his judgment, he noticed something even more unsettling. His opponent, the one who had just delivered such a powerful counter, wasn't fully composed. There was a flicker of something strange in his movements, something off. His timing was slightly too perfect, his attacks just a little too calculated. For a split second, Khamzat wondered if it was possible that his opponent wasn't even fully human. The thought was fleeting but chilling. Was this man somehow more than what he seemed? Khamzat fought to dispel the thought, forcing his focus back to the task at hand. But as the fight raged on, the feeling continued to grow. He was fighting not only a highly skilled athlete, but something else, something intangible that he couldn't quite grasp. And as the seconds passed, Khamzat realized with a sickening certainty that whatever he was facing, it was bigger than any fight he had ever been in. Each blow that landed on Khamzat's body was like a warning, a signal that the fight was slipping further out of his control. The referee's voice was drowned out by the growing intensity of the battle. The crowd was no longer cheering, they were whispering. There was something ominous in the air, something that hadn't been there before. Khamzat's breaths came in sharp gasps as the man in front of him pushed forward with relentless aggression, refusing to give an inch. In that moment, the seconds felt like hours. The noise of the crowd faded into a distant hum, and all Khamzat could hear was the thundering beat of his own heart, the rhythm of his breath, and the intense, focused presence of his opponent. He could feel every strike, every muscle in his body working to keep up, every ounce of his concentration focused solely on survival. But what was the opponent really after? This wasn't just about victory. It never was. A sudden jolt of realization hit Khamzat like a hammer. The fight was no longer a test of strength or skill. It had become something much deeper. A fight for the soul. His soul. The realization was so overwhelming that for a brief moment, he stood still, locked in place, staring down his opponent. Time seemed to stretch and twist around him, each passing second distorting his perception. And then, just as Khamzat prepared to press forward, to take control of the fight once again, his opponent took a step back. It wasn't a retreat. It was something much stranger. His eyes locked onto Khamzat's with an intensity that sent a chill through his entire body. There was no fear, no hesitation. The man in front of him wasn't just fighting for a title, a paycheck, or a legacy. He was fighting for something much more dangerous. The moment hung in the air, like a blade waiting to fall. The tension had never been greater. This wasn't just about strength anymore. This was a fight for something far darker. Khamzat could feel the heat of his opponent's gaze, and for the first time in the fight, he felt a cold chill run down his spine. The crowd's whispers were louder now, their unease palpable. Whatever was about to happen next, Khamzat knew it would change everything. As the fight continued, the stakes only grew higher. There was no turning back. The balance of power was shifting, and Khamzat had to decide whether he could rise above the fear and uncertainty to claim the victory, or if the darkness looming over the fight would swallow him whole. The final moments of the fight were drawing near, and the question on everyone's mind remained: would Khamzat emerge victorious, or would this battle be the one that broke him? The air in the arena had thickened, each breath heavier than the last. Khamzat stood face to face with his opponent, their eyes locked in a silent battle of wills. The crowd's energy had shifted, becoming a murmur of anticipation, their collective breath held in wait. For Khamzat, the world seemed to slow down, the roar of the crowd becoming a distant hum. Every muscle in his body screamed for action, but for a split second, everything in his mind stood still. He had felt fear before, but never like this, never from an opponent who seemed to defy all logic. But then, as if something snapped inside him, Khamzat surged forward with a renewed intensity. His instincts kicked in. This was his moment. He couldn't afford to hesitate. The ground beneath him seemed to tremble as he closed the distance, his body moving with a fluidity that only years of training could bring. With one powerful, calculated strike, Khamzat delivered a blow that landed squarely on his opponent's jaw. The impact reverberated through the entire arena, a thud that could be felt deep in the bones of every spectator. His opponent staggered, his hands instinctively reaching for his face as though to shield himself from the crushing force. But Khamzat wasn't done. With a precision that only a fighter of his caliber could muster, he followed up with a flurry of strikes, each one landing with brutal efficiency. His fists flew like lightning, a blur of motion, until the man in front of him could no longer keep up. A final, devastating punch landed, sending his opponent crashing to the canvas with a thud that echoed through the room. Khamzat stood over him, panting heavily, his body battered but still standing. The referee immediately moved in to assess the situation, but Khamzat's eyes never left the fallen man. He had won. The fight was over. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of his own ragged breathing, his pulse pounding in his ears. Victory. He had done it. But just as he began to relax, a strange sensation washed over him. He felt a chill crawl down his spine, his instincts screaming that something wasn't quite right. He glanced at the referee, who was now kneeling beside the fallen man. The referee's face was pale, his eyes wide with shock. Khamzat's heart skipped a beat. The man on the ground wasn't moving. Khamzat stepped back, his mind racing. Was his opponent unconscious, or was there something more to it? Crowd, once on the edge of their seats, had fallen into a stunned silence. A few seconds passed, but the man remained still. No twitch, no breath. Khamzat's stomach churned with unease. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. And then, as if the world around him had been set on pause, a sharp cry echoed through the arena. Not from the man on the floor, but from somewhere in the crowd. It was a scream that carried with it a sense of deep terror, a sound that made every hair on Khamzat's body stand on end. He turned, his eyes scanning the stands, searching for the source of the noise. But before he could react, a soft, unnerving laugh broke through the silence. It was low, almost a whisper, yet it carried the weight of 1,000 secrets. Khamzat froze, his gaze snapping back to the body of his opponent. His heart skipped a beat as he saw it something that should have been impossible. The body on the floor wasn't just still, it was changing. The man's limbs twitched violently, as if some unseen force was pulling them in every direction. His eyes, once dull and lifeless, snapped open wide and filled with an eerie glow. His chest rose in a shallow, unnatural breath, and for the first time, Khamzat felt true fear. The man was no longer the opponent he had fought. He was something else, something far darker. Before Khamzat could react, the body of the man jerked upright in one swift motion, as if controlled by an invisible hand. The arena erupted in chaos, the crowd scattering in panic as they realized the danger that had just been unleashed. But Khamzat remained rooted in place, his eyes wide, unable to look away. The man, no, whatever it was, stood before him, its body twisted and contorted in unnatural angles. Its smile was twisted, mocking, and its eyes burned with a fiery intensity that seemed to pierce into Khamzat's very soul. What are you? Khamzat's voice was barely a whisper, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. The creature, because that's what it now seemed to be, tilted its head in an almost childlike manner, its grin never faltering. It spoke in a voice that was both familiar and foreign, like a whisper from the very depths of darkness. The creature, because that's what it now seemed to be, tilted its head in an almost childlike manner, its grin never faltering. It spoke in a voice that was both familiar and foreign, like a whisper from the very depths of darkness. "I am the one you were never meant to defeat," it said, its voice sending a chill through Khamzat's bones. "And now you will pay the price for your victory." Khamzat's body tensed, every muscle screaming for action. He had faced opponents before, each one dangerous in its own way, but this was different. This wasn't just a fight for a title, a trophy, or pride. This was a fight for survival. The darkness that had overtaken his opponent now had a life of its own, and Khamzat had no idea how to stop it. Without warning, the creature lunged at him, faster than he could react. Khamzat barely managed to sidestep, his instincts kicking in as he scrambled to regain his footing. The creature was relentless, its movements quick and unpredictable. It wasn't like any fighter Khamzat had ever faced. It didn't fight with skill or technique. It fought with something far more primal, an ancient, raw energy that seemed to defy the laws of nature. Khamzat's heart raced as he dodged another vicious strike, but he knew that this was no longer about technique. It was about something much darker. The creature wasn't just fighting to win, it was fighting to consume. And Khamzat was its target. He pushed himself harder, refusing to let this dark force overtake him. He knew that if he didn't fight back with everything he had, there was no way he would survive. His vision blurred with adrenaline, his focus narrowing to a single point: survival. The creature's movements were erratic, its unpredictability making it almost impossible to track. But Khamzat was relentless. He kept moving, kept dodging, and with every strike that missed, he grew more desperate to find a way to end this nightmare. Then, in a split second, he saw a weakness. A small opening in the creature's defense. It was all he needed. With one swift motion, Khamzat lunged forward, his fist connecting with the creature's chest with a force that could shatter bones. But instead the satisfying thud of impact, there was a sickening, hollow sound, as though his punch had landed on something far more sinister than mere flesh. The creature staggered back, but it didn't fall. Its grin only widened. "You think you've won?" it hissed, its voice dripping with malice. "This is only the beginning." And just like that, Khamzat's entire world came crashing down. What had started as a battle for victory had now become something far darker, something that no fighter, no matter how skilled, could ever prepare for. The final twist had been revealed, and the true fight for survival had only just begun. The creature's words hung in the air like a shadow, its laugh still echoing through Khamzat's mind. He was no longer facing a mere fighter, no longer in a contest of strength or skill. He had awakened something that shouldn't have been stirred, and now it was clear he was trapped in a fight that went beyond physical power. His opponent was no longer human. It was something else, entirely something far older, more dangerous. Khamzat stood frozen, trying to process the horror that had just unfolded. He had witnessed the impossible, the body of a defeated man coming to life in an unnatural, grotesque way. His heart raced, his breath shallow as he felt the weight of the situation press in on him. Every instinct he had was screaming at him to run, to escape. But he knew, deep down, that there was no escape. Not anymore. The creature before him raised its head, its glowing eyes fixed on Khamzat, a twisted mockery of the man he had once fought. It was watching him with a predator's gaze, as if waiting for him to make a mistake. But Khamzat wasn't about to give it that satisfaction. He had come too far, fought too hard to be intimidated now. His muscles tensed, his stance widening as he prepared himself for the next strike. He knew that it wouldn't be easy. This wasn't a fight he could win through brute force alone. He had to think differently, to outsmart it. But how? What could defeat something that defied all logic? Something that operated on a level far beyond the rules of combat he knew so well. The creature lunged again, faster this time. Khamzat barely managed to duck, the force of its attack sending a gust of wind in his direction. He could feel the heat of its breath on his skin, a reminder that it was still there, still hunting him. He dodged another strike, his body reacting before his mind could catch up. Each movement felt instinctual, born of years of training, years of facing opponents who had pushed him to the limit. But this was different. This wasn't just a fight. It was a battle for his very soul. Khamzat's mind raced, his thoughts tumbling over each other as he searched for a way to turn the tide. He had faced adversity before, but this was unlike anything he had encountered. The creature before him was relentless, its strikes fueled by an otherworldly power that seemed to grow with each passing moment. In the chaos of the fight, Khamzat's eyes locked onto something. It was subtle at first, a flicker in the air that seemed to shimmer in the dim light of the arena. And then he saw it, a symbol, carved into the ground where the creature had risen. The mark wasn't just a symbol, it was a gateway, a remnant of an ancient ritual that had somehow brought this creature to life. It was the key to understanding how to defeat it. Khamzat's heart skipped a beat as the realization hit him. The creature wasn't just a monster. It was a product of a dark, forbidden ritual, one that had bound it to the world in a way that should never have been possible. And now, that ritual had to be undone. But how? Khamzat's mind raced, his breath coming faster as the creature closed in, its eyes burning with malevolent intent. He couldn't defeat it by strength alone. No, he had to break the bond, destroy the ritual that had brought it into being. As if sensing Khamzat's thoughts, the creature charged once again, its movements lightning fast. This time, Khamzat was ready. With a primal roar, he dodged to the side, narrowly avoiding the creature's claws as they slashed through the air where he had been only seconds before. But Khamzat wasn't focused on the fight anymore. His eyes were fixed on the symbol, and his mind was calculating, working through the steps he needed to take. He needed to reach the symbol, destroy it. With a surge of energy, Khamzat darted forward, weaving through the chaos of the battle. The creature was hot on his heels, its growls filling the air as it tried to close the gap. Khamzat could feel the heat of its presence, its aura, like a furnace, burning everything in its path. But he pushed forward, focusing solely on the goal. The symbol was just within reach, but the creature was closer now, its claws outstretched as it aimed to tear Khamzat apart. With a final burst of speed, Khamzat reached the symbol, slamming his fist down into the ground beside it. The moment his hand made contact with the earth, something strange happened. The ground beneath him began to rumble, the air thickening with an energy that felt both ancient and alive. The creature recoiled, its eyes wide with fear, as if it knew something was changing. Khamzat's pulse raced, his every nerve alight with the intensity of the moment. He could feel the bond between the creature and the ritual beginning to unravel, like threads being pulled apart. The creature screamed in fury, its form twisting and writhing as if it were caught in an invisible trap. Khamzat's breath came ragged gasps, but he didn't stop. He knew this was his chance. The ritual had to be destroyed. He slammed his fist into the symbol again, this time with all the strength he could muster. The ground beneath him shook, the air crackling with energy. The creature howled in pain, its form flickering like a flame caught in the wind. And then, with one final earth-shattering roar, the creature collapsed. For a moment, the arena was still. The crowd had fallen silent, the tension hanging thick in the air. Khamzat stood, panting heavily, his body bruised and battered. The creature was gone, vanished into nothingness, its form dissipating like smoke in the wind. Khamzat's eyes scanned the arena, the once chaotic scene now eerily quiet. He had won, but the victory felt hollow. The ritual had been broken, the creature destroyed, but Khamzat knew something had changed. He could feel it deep within him, a sense that this battle was just one in a much larger war. There were forces at work in the world, dark, ancient forces that had only just begun to stir. As the crowd began to cheer, their voices slowly rising in celebration, Khamzat's mind was elsewhere. The fight was over, but the journey was far from finished. The battle had been won, but the war against whatever darkness had been awakened was just beginning. He had faced the unimaginable and come out victorious. But at what cost? What had he truly destroyed, and what had he set into motion? Only time would tell. As the lights of the arena faded around him, Khamzat couldn't help but wonder, was this the beginning of the end, or the end of the beginning? Only the future would reveal the truth. But one thing was certain, Khamzat would be ready for whatever came next. And so, the story didn't end with the final blow. It ended with the knowledge that true battles, the ones that really matter, are never fought in a single moment. They are fought in the silence between victories, in the whispers of what lies just beyond the horizon.